Stephen J. Peterson, Esquire. Uh, Basically, talk a little bit about what's happening in the real estate world. Also, one of the main things that we like to do, and Earl, you started a little bit earlier, right before a lot of people got on, but ask them specific questions so you can get very specific answers. So to your situation and to what's happening and what's going on from your own perspective. So for those folks who don't know Steve Peterson, I'm going to say, well, I'm really surprised. The, the key thing here is that I've known Steve, I don't know, going back to the beginning almost of Freedom First, and have found him to be one of the top real estate lawyers in, well, from my standpoint, the whole world. But
thank you.
We have to think about it from the perspective of our area, and I can make the latter comment because I know more than one or two real estate attorneys outside of New York State, so certainly beat the hell out of them very easily. So the key thing here is if you are going to be looking to do something in real estate, you need someone who is a real estate attorney, who understands what needs to be done, who understands how to do it, and Steve is that person. So
thank you.
I could go on and on and on, but I won't. I'm going to give the controls. Well, Joe or either Andy is going to give the controls over to Steve. So, Steve, thank you
All right.
for being here.
Thank you. Steve Peterson, Peterson Spadarico is the name of my firm. I cannot see who the 41 people are that are on, so I don't actually know how many of you I've worked with or I know. I spoke this morning at the meeting, and I found that what I thought worked really well was just a significant question and answer where everybody was chipping in, and I wasn't just controlling the conversation. From my perspective, there's a very significant change in the way we're practicing law, and one of the things that's happened is that a number of real estate lawyers that had a very significant piece of the pie that they were doing closings for decided that this was just the last straw. They didn't feel as though they were making enough money to justify it, and they closed their offices in the last few weeks. So for instance, I don't know how many of you have ever dealt with Steve Butcher, but Steve had a very, very nice practice, lots of clients, and he closed his office effective last Friday. And it's happened to a number of lawyers. The other thing that we're seeing is that a lot of the law firms laid off most of their employees. One firm that we do a lot of closings with eliminated all of their support staff, and only the lawyers and the lawyer's son is working at the law firm now. Obviously makes it much more difficult to find somebody to work with. My partner Derek and I made a decision very early on that we were not going to lay anyone off, and that we were going to struggle through and figure it out. And some of you may see that, for instance, my approval letters may be a day or so later than they used to be, because our receptionist is a wonderful woman. She's 70 years old, and she's had some medical issues. So she now comes in at 5 o'clock every day. And when I go in on Sundays, once in a while, I'll find her sitting there opening files and doing things like that. So it's just some small things that we had to do. The other thing that we found is that we've very much changed the way that you do a closing. Sellers, attorneys, and sellers are no longer invited to the closing. No one wants additional people in the room. So the seller's attorney sends paperwork the day before or the morning of the closing with very specific escrow instructions as to how the funds are to be written, how the funds are to be returned, whether by Federal Express or PDQ. And when you have a closing at 3:30 on a Friday afternoon and the buyer's attorney is not returning your phone calls, it just makes it a little difficult to tell your client how well the closing went, since no one was in the room except possibly the buyer's attorney, because most closings now are being done either on Zoom or on FaceTime. Or we had one client that was just very wary of, didn't have any idea how to do it. So one of my paralegals we discovered was friends on Facebook with one of her friends. So they friended each other through the friend, and we did a closing over Facebook. And you're just finding that you're doing all sorts of things like that. The easiest for me is obviously if someone has an iPhone. FaceTime is a piece of cake, and we're doing what we do is that the bank attorney will send me the package. I will look at each document on my computer as my client pulls it up and signs it. The governor has allowed us to notarize documentation as long as we see the client signing it over FaceTime, over Zoom, and we see a copy of their license that they actually hold the license up so you know it's them. There's more rules which make it even a little bit more difficult, which I think I can say not everyone is following all of these rules, because the bottom line is the paperwork comes back, the paperwork gets notarized, and in the future, no one will ever know whether or not you were sitting down with the client as the notary or whether you did it long distance. This only works if the client is in New York State. For instance, if my daughter had to sign paperwork in New Jersey, I would not be able to notarize it that way. We were very hopeful that you'd be able to do wills the same way, because I'm trying very hard not to do in-person things if you can avoid it. So I'm doing significantly less wills than I normally do. Although I have a client that lives near the cottage that I own, and I have a large barn, and he and his wife came and we sat in a very cold barn last Saturday and we did a will because we had a 8-foot table and there was no problem separating ourselves. But it is challenging. I think what I found for us is that we have so much office space that's not being used. And usually there are people coming and going all the time, and it's just very loud and it's crazy, and there's people coming in, there's people going out, there's people sitting in the couches. You can hear a pin drop now because almost all the closings are being done on video. It's really a fairly major change. And I think it might be a long-term change because, for instance, last night I was watching the news and saw that Chase and a number of other banks are not going to bring many of their employees back. People are going to be working from home significantly. One of the computer companies said that they're just going to abandon their building and they're going to do everything long distance. So it's just hard to know, where that's going to take us. The courts are opening effective on Monday. The courts were 100% completely closed, except that a judge could have a conversation with the lawyers, once again over Zoom. But there were no papers being filed. There was no actual legal work being done between attorneys in litigation. They're opening on Monday, but we don't know what that means. There's going to be some people in the building, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be jury trials or anything like that in the immediate future. How they're going to do evictions in Rochester, once you're allowed to do them again in August, where you used to have 100 people sitting in the courtroom on top of each other. You'd have a dozen lawyers sitting in the jury box on top of each other. I just really can't figure out how all of those sorts of things are going to take place. Someone mentioned that I should talk about wills and trusts and powers of attorney. this morning. And I guess the important thing is for all of us that they're just a really good idea to have, because there's, they had said that the age range was 60 and above for getting the virus, but we're seeing young people getting the virus. We're seeing people survive. We're seeing people not survive. You need to have a living will in place, because you're not allowed to go to the hospital with your spouse or your kid if, God forbid, they get the virus. I don't know how many of you know, there's a lawyer, Ted O'Brien. Teddy's been in the hospital since early March, and he has not seen his family since that time. He no longer has the virus, but his lungs are damaged enough that he's still on a ventilator for a few hours a day. So, it's just an important thing to get your paperwork in order, have a power of attorney, have somebody that can make your health care decisions, and have a will which lays out how you want your property to be split in the event of your death. People don't like to talk about it. People don't like to do it, but it's just a really good idea. My stuff is old. My grandchildren now are the age that my children were when I did the will. So, it's the old shoemaker story. I have to sit down and redo my will because I'm in that stupid target range for getting the virus, if you believe the news reports. One of my clients refuses to wear a mask. And I told her that she wasn't allowed to come to the office anymore. She says she doesn't wear masks, and that can be your personal decision, but no one is actually allowed into our office unless they're wearing a mask. And it's to protect all of us. I'm there with probably 9 or 10 paralegals that we've been huddled together since this thing started. Shirley and Zenny and I are basically, if you want to call it, we're quarantined together during the day. And that's the only way that we've been able to make it work. Some of the law firms have done it long distance, but I found that it's difficult when your paralegal is not in the same building, when your paperwork is not in the same building. To give people proper, timely answers is very difficult. And I find it interesting that realtors aren't allowed to leave their house. They're not allowed to show a property. They're not allowed to show up at the walkthrough. And I thought that all of that sort of thing, where the clients weren't coming to the closings, where the seller's attorney wasn't coming to the closing, or even the parties weren't at the closing, was going to make it hellish. That you were going to have all these problems, that the refrigerator doesn't work. How are we going to fix the refrigerator? Do we have an escrow? And it has been just the opposite. It seems as though when push comes to shove, if the buyer and the seller have to do the walkthrough together, there are no longer arguments about small, mediocre things that don't deserve to be a problem at the closing. And they don't seem to be. Nobody is saying anymore, how do I get a key? Everybody's working out the key in advance. So from my perspective, I don't know how long this is going to last. Are we always going to do closings that way, or are sellers' attorneys going to start going to closing again? Any questions about any of that? Come on, Joe, you must have some question.
You're answering them all for me.
Good.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is there any chance that we can do something to help persuade those in power to keep it the way it is versus changing it back?
Well, I think to some extent that the 2 o'clock sessions that Jamie is doing with the coalition are working toward that. I honestly don't think that Cuomo is going to allow the notarization to stand once everyone's back to work. Although I think I love it. I think it's great. Are people I'm seeing as many contracts in general as I probably did a year ago. particularly 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I'm also seeing that almost all of the contracts that involve real estate agents are coming from the same real estate agents, that you're either full throttle going forward, or you're treating the pandemic as though it's a time for you to be retired and you're going to start from scratch when it's over with. You know, the problem with that is that I think that to some extent we're all going to be affected for at least the rest of this year by the virus, no matter how much things are going to open up. Someone with a green button is trying to get in.
Steve, this is Elliot Katz speaking. My question is, what is being done now for engineers inspections?
The engineers are allowed to go into the house. They are wearing almost the equivalent, from what I understand, of a hazmat suit. And typically there are not other parties with them, and the sellers are not there, and the real estate agents are not allowed to be there. But what I have seen is that the real estate agents are on FaceTime with the engineers going through the house. And in fact, I've heard a number of occasions where the realtor's out in the car during the walkthrough, so that if in fact the buyer runs into a problem with the seller, at least the realtor knows what's going on. So I think there's a lot of that sort of thing happening. I'm seeing significantly more contracts that do not have engineers inspections. I just find it difficult to believe when I get a contract that has no inspection contingency and my client hasn't even seen the house yet. So, but it's such a strong bidding war market that that things like that are happening so that people can get a house under contract. I've heard of transactions where there were 17 or 19 purchase offers for one house over a weekend. Clearly not enough houses on the market. A lot of people thought this was going to lead to a buyer's market, but I think it's significantly still a seller's market. Colleen, would you agree?
I 100% agree. There's been no slowdown in the seller's market, in my opinion. The only slowdown's been that sellers are still afraid to put their house on the market, but the more they're becoming aware of the virtual showings that we're able to conduct and the way that we're generally doing virtual open houses and whatnot, the sellers are starting to understand it's okay to list now. And it is a great time to list.
Oh, well, it would normally be the perfect time to list.
And a house that may not be the perfect house is no longer an issue. You know, you might remember a couple years ago where, you know, somebody walk in and they'd be like, "Oh, I don't like the color of paint, so I'm not buying the house." That's not the case anymore.
Yeah,
They're not picky.
You could just feel that people are not picky. Picky
Yep.
are less picky at the walkthrough. I mean, just in general, everybody seems to have calmed down. Out of necessity, probably.
Agreed. Yep.
I'm getting a lot less questions during the closing because we're just going through page by page, and they've got a stack like this in front of them, and they've got their kids running around in the dining room, and they just want to get through the papers and get it over with. What's my mortgage payment? What's my interest rate? Please get me out of this as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, I got a question for you. Because I've been hearing from other people where all of a sudden they get to the closing table, and these are for the owner occupants, and some of them have actually not been able to close because obviously they were temporarily out of a job. Have you been seeing a lot of that?
I haven't, but there is a new form signed at most bank closings saying that you are currently employed and nothing has changed. Yeah, but you're absolutely correct. It's a problem. My daughter works for a multinational company in food service, and they just applied for a mortgage refinance. And I told her husband that he's got to do this thing as quickly as possible because she's only guaranteed a job through the beginning of June. And if she gets laid off, it won't close. So it is definitely a problem. The other problem I've had, and it's investors from out of state that want to come to Rochester. They want to see the house. They want to be at the final inspection. They want to sign the papers in person, and they're using all of the pandemic. You can't do this. You can't do that. We've pushed the closing. I would say it was probably supposed to close April 30th. I've now made time of the essence for June 8th, and they've agreed that they're probably going to drive in from Boston, notwithstanding the fact that the family they have most of their families in Rochester, but their family won't let them stay with them because the husband is a physician working in an ER. So they should close. They should have their property manager look at the property. But it's just one of those times where I represented the buyer and the seller. The seller insisted I kept them. The buyer went someplace else, and she is just driving her lawyer insane. So yeah, it definitely does affect. There are people that are playing the game of using the pandemic to extend closings, for sure. It's less than I would have expected, though. Are you seeing the same thing? Have you lost closings as a result of that?
No, I've been hearing stuff. Are you talking to me or Colleen? I'm sorry.
I'm looking at you.
Oh, I can't tell.
I'm only looking at you from the nose up, though. It looks like.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go. How's that? I don't know. No, I mean, because I've had other people reach out to me, say, hey, listen, my closing, these people aren't going to buy or whatever, though, but their prices were so sky high. I'm just like, I'm not your guy. But,
yeah, no, owner occupied is definitely an issue if you think you're going to get laid off. Even though a lot of people that are getting laid off between between unemployment and the extra $600. One of our staff is elderly, and she comes in on the bus from Brockport every day, and she's the only person that we said, look, this just doesn't make sense for you to be doing this. She's making more money now than she's ever made before working for us. So at least until the $600 a week portion ends, she's better off staying home. Except if she's refinancing. Here's your opportunity to ask any questions that you want. Pat was nice enough to point out to me this morning that if you are evicting a person for holdover or for violating a lease as opposed to non-payment, that city court is in fact going to be open for those sorts of things beginning in the middle of June. I don't know what the effect is going to be. I don't know if you've got a perfect case of holdover during the pandemic, whether a judge is actually going to give a warrant and evict somebody. And I don't know whether the marshals or the sheriffs in the civil bureau with the sheriff's department are working and would even be able to do a warrant if that happened. But at least it shows at least a little bit of a loosening. The one problem that I'd never thought about, because I always thought that if you're going to give an abatement for the rent, that you have to give an abatement for mortgage payments. Maybe you have to give an abatement for real estate taxes or a portion. But that doesn't take into account the large number of investors that don't have a mortgage on the property and have retired, or this is their employment, so they're just not making money if they don't collect the rent. And it's just an impossible thing to cover that under any of the current programs, as far as I can tell.
Steve, could I ask a question not related?
Sure.
So recently, through some emails, you had encouraged me to reach out to real estate agents if I'm an investor thinking about doing assignments. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
It's an interesting question. We have heard from reliable sources that there is a New York State Attorney General investigation over wholesaling. And I know one particular lawyer has in fact provided documentation to the New York State Attorney General's office on wholesaling closings that he had. So there's one of two reasons that the investigation would be taking place. One is the whole notion of the of HEPTA, the Homeowners Theft Act, and whether or not an investor is stealing the property from the poor owner and shouldn't be entitled to do that. The second is whether or not, whether it's the real estate boards or individual realtors have complained to the Attorney General that if you're collecting an assignment fee, it is the equivalent of collecting a real estate commission, and only a licensed real estate agent or broker is allowed to collect a real estate commission. And that's why I've recommended, until there's an answer to this question, that if you're going to be the middleman has the best argument about collecting an assignment if they are in fact a realtor. I personally think that it's the realtor thing and not the protecting the homeowner idea at all. I think it's all about real estate commissions and the fact that the realtors obviously have a very good lobby.
So I take that as a suggestion to squad up with a realtor who I happen to have one, who's a good friend, and work out some sort of equitable arrangement for
Correct.
that to be the case moving forward.
Correct.
Now,
I've heard of one investor who, on occasion, if he is assigning it to somebody he trusts, there's no assignment fee in his assignment, but people somehow manage to work it out after the closing. But that you can't do that on most deals because you're not dealing with people that you deal with every day that you can trust in the situation.
Steve, didn't the beginning of this Attorney General investigation start with all the Dubai people?
Well, I'm guessing that what was it? Hoo-hoo,
Yeah.
H-O-O-H-O-O.
Yeah. Yep.
Is really what started the whole thing. Mr. Hoo-hoo and his wife were buying properties in Rochester, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, maybe.
Mhm.
And then he turned around and he sold them to people in Cyprus. And Mr. Hoo-hoo and his wife are now in prison in Cyprus. At one point, he gave a power of attorney to a man, which oddly enough, the power of attorney never got filed at the Monroe County Clerk's office. So there are a significant number of houses that cannot be sold because the person with the power of attorney signed the deeds, and there's no proof that he actually had a power of attorney. He is also sitting in a prison cell in Cyprus with the Hoo-hoos. And there were huge articles in the Buffalo newspapers. I'm not sure if they were actually in the Rochester newspapers, but it got national attention with large photographs of the Hoo-hoos in the houses, because none of the houses were ever working, and no work of any kind was ever done on any of the houses. For not only did they not put in the $50,000 kitchens that they collected money for, but nobody ever cut the grass or removed the snow or even opened the front door one time. I know a lot of the houses in Detroit actually were knocked down. So yeah, I would guess that there's a very good chance that that's what started the whole thing, because he was collecting assignment fees, and he was also selling some of the properties to investors. I think if you're selling a property, if you do a double closing, I think you're protected, because you're not collecting a real estate commission. You're collecting profit on a house that you've purchased and sold. So from my way of thinking, that's the cure. The thing is that you're spending a decent amount of money to do two closings. You're paying me twice. You're paying filing fees twice. You're maybe paying title insurance twice. But in the scheme of things, it's better than being on the investigative end of the Attorney General. And unfortunately, nobody knows where that's at or what's happening at all.
So, Steve, on that, I know you're talking about, because I know I've had to do some double closings and things like that. So, and I think about it and I'm like, what's the difference if you do an assignment or a double close? Because if you still end up with almost the exact same amount of money,
I think it's the fact that you are actually taking title. You're signing a deed. So you're selling a piece of real estate. And when you're assigning the contract, all you're doing is selling the contract. You basically went and got an option to purchase the property, and then you try to farm it out to someone else. See, you're willing in almost 99% of your cases. In fact, I don't even know if you've ever had one where when the assignment person backed out, you didn't step in and buy it yourself. There are significant numbers of investors all over town that are only going to close on this transaction if they assign it, because they only have $12 in the bank and they don't have the ability to show the $38,000 cash needed for closing. Somebody, I don't think it was you, Joe, but somebody had this company. They were floating around a couple of years ago where they got a letter saying that I have money held for so-and-so. All they have to do is the property has to appraise and they have to meet certain qualifications. And they took that letter and they tried to use that as proof of funds. They're back because I have a client that is trying to use that letter as proof of funds. And the seller's attorney is like 27, 28 years old. I was hoping that when I sent it over, it would just kind of go over his head and we'd probably get it closed. But he caught it and he said, this is not proof of funds. We can't accept this. We're going to sell the house to somebody else if you don't fix it in the next couple of days. Proof of funds is real money. Now, proof of funds giving proof of funds is no guarantee, because no one has that I have to get the money from you and hold it. So you can use the same $50,000 in the bank for proof of funds for 5 houses that you're buying for $50,000 each. So it's not really any kind of a guarantee, but it makes people sleep better. Anybody?
Yeah, Steve, I have a quick question. You were mentioning that the city courts are opening up for foreclosures and things. Are the circuit court opening for probates as well? Or is it just circuit court?
They're open at the moment on a very limited basis. So if you have a real estate closing that you have to get done, you can go into surrogate's court and you can get temporary letters. I don't know how long it's going to take before they're truly open.
So when you say you can get temporary letters, that's an interesting point you bring up, because there's a case that I have that needs to get a letter of guardianship for a minor.
That may be a very different thing, because they typically have to have a hearing for that. You can't waive the hearing. You have to appoint a lawyer. I would think that would not fall into the exception that I'm talking about. The court's going to appoint a law guardian to talk to the child or the parents. I think it's more complicated.
Because in the situation that it was a divorced couple. The the daughter is living with the one parent, the other parent was the one that passed away. So, I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer that the child would go with the surviving parent. So I don't know that they would need to do a whole lot except let the child stay with the parent that's still surviving.
My opinion, and I actually use another lawyer for doing most of my estates because it is such a specialized thing. My opinion is that you might be able to get temporary letters in that situation.
Okay, so it's open enough for that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know you can. There are people in the court because, for instance, abstract companies, when someone dies, the abstract companies for doing the whole abstract of title so that you can prove title is good, they actually have to get into the surrogate's offices to look through their records. So I know there's at least a record keeper there.
Well, they're answering the phones, but they're not getting into, they're not taking probate filings and things like that.
Correct.
So when they're saying the court is closed, but are they giving out letters for things like that that the families need? That's what this family didn't know.
I've had 2 cases where I've gotten temporary letters so that I could sell the house.
Okay.
So I would think that you could do that.
All right, thanks.
Anybody?
Steve, do you think there's going to be a big glut of commercial properties with all these companies have decided to keep their employees home from now on?
Oh, I think nationally, for sure. I don't know about locally, but I think that nationally there's going to be these magnificent buildings that are empty that are going to be for sale. I'm guessing that a lot of them are in these real estate investment trusts, which people thought were pretty much a guaranteed thing. You've got a 25, 30-year lease, net. How can you not make money? So, it's interesting. I mean, I think the lawyers that are going to be in the best shape are divorce lawyers, and for years bankruptcy lawyers were retiring because the practice of bankruptcy had really turned into not much of anything, and I think bankruptcy is going to go crazy. Colleen, tell people about the sign you have in your front yard.
I've got a sign in my front yard that says, when the quarantine ends, oh goodness, what's it say? If you can't stand who you're living with, call me, I'm a realtor.
And I think there's going to be a lot of psychiatrists and a lot of divorce lawyers making a lot of money. This would be a good time to own a liquor store, from what I've been told.
I agree.
In fact, I'm surprised I don't see anyone drinking now.
You missed it, Steve. That was a little bit earlier.
That could be. It could be.
He's got his little triangle up so you don't see it. But Steve, actually going back to there was a question on on wills and trusts. Somebody had asked what roughly what a cost for a will or power of attorney and that would be.
I would estimate that you're talking under $300 or so for a fairly easy standard will, and probably $150 each for powers of attorney and living wills. I would think lock, stock, and barrel, if you did 2 sets of each of them, you'd probably be talking in the $800 range.
Okay.
But now I've seen bills from some of these large law firms that do a product that I think compares very nicely with mine, with another 0 next to the bill. I mean, it's just astounding, some of the bills that I see when people bring their parents' paperwork in for me to review.
Can you elaborate a little bit, Steve, on the trust, the benefits of a trust, and when a trust is a good thing to have compared to just a regular will?
There's two trusts that people talk about. There's a trust which just keeps your estate out of probate, and there's a trust that if you put everything into the trust, you can avoid a Medicaid lien. A Medicaid trust has to be in effect for approximately 6 years. But what it does is it puts literally all of your assets into a trust that you have no control over. You name your trustees. You can't change your trustees. If you have an argument with your kid and your kid's the trustee, you're just out of luck. Because Medicaid says that if you have the power to change the trustee, if you have the power to force them to give you money, that the state can break in and get the money, because then it's not really a Medicaid trust. And then you have the typical family trust that you see much more often. And the purpose of that is to avoid probate. You put all your assets in the trust, and when the person dies, everything passes without having to go to court at all.
So that first trust that you're saying, Medicaid trust, is for if I was put into a home?
Correct. It's to protect you. It's to protect you from social services if someone goes into a home.
So you wouldn't lose your assets.
I've seen very few of them, because even on a couple occasions when I've drafted them, when clients have actually come and read it and realized what they were doing, they changed their mind and they never signed them. You know, because you are giving away all the power. And as much as people say, "Oh, I trust my kids," signing it is definitely different.
They trust them up till signing.
Correct. You know, and
Yeah.
some people want to put a bank in, but to my way of thinking, you need groceries and you got to call the bank and ask them to send you $100. I think that's just terrible. But a non-Medicaid trust is a good thing. The question is, you're going to spend significantly more to do a trust than you are to do a will. So you can do a trust now and you can pay the lawyer, or you can die and have your will probated and let your kids pay a lawyer. So, a lot of people don't do them once I explain that.
Steve, what's like an average cost for a trust?
You're going to spend a couple $1,000s. The guys that do it, the guys that you see advertising on television are charging $3,500 to $5,000.
Okay.
Would that include a contingency beneficiary, or what is it, contingent beneficiary trust?
Sure. And what it doesn't include, and you would be astounded as to how often people do these just absolutely fancy, beautiful trusts, sign them up, take them home, put them on a shelf, and never move the assets into the trust. Just because you have a trust doesn't mean that the trust owns anything. You have to do deeds, you have to change bank accounts, you have to change insurance policies, and lawyers don't seem to follow through and do that part of it. So you end up with a beautiful book, but it's got no assets of any kind.
Right. Has to be
That would be I'm sorry. That would be part of the $2,000 the lawyer would be charged to help them follow through on changing everything to put it into the trust.
Well, let's say that you own a dozen properties. You're going to spend $3,000 doing deeds to those properties into the trust, between filing fees and legal fees for doing deeds. So that part of it can be costly. If you have one bank account with $500,000 in it, or $1 million in it, and you have one house, the cost is nominal.
Steve, I have another question regarding living trusts. If you transfer ownership of an LLC into a living trust, do you need to amend the operating agreement for the LLC?
I would say you probably would have to. You're not talking a living trust is the thing that says I don't want to be hooked up to machines.
No, I'm talking about a
You're talking basically
revocable trust.
a
Revocable trust.
revocable family trust. I would say you'd probably want to amend the minutes. I'd have to look at the operating agreement, see if it referred to the members as human beings, but it would be a very nominal change.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The problem when you get into with those things is now you own your house and you've got it in a trust, and you go to the bank, and the bank says that to do your refinance, that you've got to take it out of the trust and you've got to put it back in your name, because they only will qualify you personally, because otherwise they can't have it be a Fannie Mae product, which is the same as, for most banks, you got it in an LLC, you have to take it out of the LLC, and then after the closing in a few months, we put it back in the LLC. Very similar.
Isn't a shortcut to all the legal expense of deeds just to use your LLC? If you have one LLC owning all the properties, I know that's not ideal. That's not always recommended. But if you do go that route, that would save you on all the deed costs when you're using the trust, right? Because you just...
If it's all in the LLC, and then you would have the trust own the LLC. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm talking the situation where you've just got them in your individual names, and just having it in one LLC. I would say most of my clients actually do have it in one LLC. I have one REIA member who has one property per LLC, which is just a bookkeeping nightmare and very expensive. When he sells a property, he reuses the same LLC, so he's not constantly adding to it. But the problem that you get into by having everything in one LLC is that your assets are so significant in that LLC that you've completely lost the benefit of the LLC, because the point of the LLC is to protect yourself individually from a creditor or a lawsuit where the tenant sues over lead paint. Or something like that, and then now you've thrown everything into one LLC. It's the exact same situation.
So Steve, to that question, couldn't you achieve the same thing by using like a land trust?
Land trusts are not very popular in Rochester. They are very rarely used because buyers' attorneys are not familiar with them and they don't trust them. So it's very difficult to sell a property when you have it in these land trusts. They just don't fit the general mode for all of the lawyers that do onesies or twosies of closings. Most of the land trusts I've seen are like 2.5 pages saying, I hereby put such and such in a land trust. The trustee is, in one case years ago, the trustee was my client's wife using her maiden name and giving her an address in California. And his position was that if the tenants didn't know where to find her, they wouldn't bother them. I just don't think that worked on any level. I very much prefer an LLC.
So like, and this is a little bit of a different question altogether. So if you were to, say, take on a property that had an existing mortgage on it, subject to, as an example, putting it in your LLC would be better than a land trust, is what I'm hearing from you.
Yes. Now I drafted probably 5 years ago a very nice subject to form, and I have never found I've never found a seller's attorney that would allow us to use it, because no matter how much trouble the seller is in, if the buyer doesn't make the mortgage payments on the closing, it's the seller's credit that's going to be ruined, whether you put it in a land trust or an LLC or not.
So Steve, I was listening to what you were saying and trying to understand. Do you want to have separate LLCs to protect your portfolio of many houses? Or do
I
you
would,
want just
I would say that you don't need to hit, if you've got 12 houses, you don't need 12 LLCs, but maybe 4.
maybe 4? So you
Figure out
level.
what I tell people is maybe you figure out if you've got one house with $1 million worth of equity on East Avenue, maybe it gets its own. If you've got 12 inner city properties that you did owner held financing on, and it's got like $80,000 in equity between the 10 properties, you can put 10 properties into one. It's not a problem. It's not the number of properties. It's the type of value that each of the houses has.
Good. Thank you.
Sure.
Steve, on the subject twos, one of the things that I worry about on those is if you know, if the seller all of a sudden starts, you know, racking up, and I don't know if you found this or not, but one of the things that worries me about those is that all of a sudden the seller goes and start racking up credit cards or liens against them. And you've been paying on this place for 3, 4, 5 years. You basically
that's you're confusing the land contract with the subject to. A subject to deal is where you're changing the title and you're assuming the mortgage, but you're not assuming it. You're not signing an assumption deed. You're not physically agreeing to pay the note. You're literally just getting the deed subject to the mortgage. A land contract is where that can happen. And one of my clients completely renovated a house, and we got to closing to find out that the seller owes $150,000 to the IRS. And the seller came to the tenants and said, tough luck, you need to pay me the rent now.
wow.
Yeah, so and that's a pending thing. We tried to collect rent for as long as we could to try to get some of the renovation costs back. But there's no way she's going to get the property. So, you know, how do you protect yourself? Well, maybe you do an abstract when you sign the land contract, but that, like you said, that doesn't guarantee that they're not going to go crazy and get judgments and tax liens and other things after the land contract, but before the closing. That's why I don't like land contracts. I think they're very dangerous. Land contracts, options to purchase. A lot of people are using these options to purchase where they have an option to purchase and they have a lease. And in Rochester City Court, the judges say that lease is not really a lease. It's part of a purchase offer. And so if people don't pay a lease where there's an option agreement, you can't get an eviction. So I'm just not a huge fan of options.
I have another question.
Sure.
I feel like I'm the only one talking.
No problem.
So how would you structure, if you were interested in doing a rent to own agreement? So you had a tenant buyer. How would you structure that agreement?
Well, to start with, I'm not a fan at all. I had a situation where in Brockport, where the tenant wasn't going to move, knew that she couldn't be evicted. Every time my client went to the house, the police were there waiting for him. And the court said that it was not an eviction. They said that you had to go to court and do, it's almost the equivalent of a foreclosure. So instead of taking 3 weeks or a month that it normally takes to get someone out in eviction, with an ejectment action, you could be talking closer to 6 months to a year. So one way to do it is is to sign a purchase offer with a certain date and a certain time. So it's not just an option, it's an actual deal. And you give the buyer prepossession of the property pursuant to a prepossession agreement. But you just have to get enough of a down payment that it's going to hurt the buyer to walk away. It's all about the down payment. If you have to do an ejectment action and it takes you a year to get your house back, they're not going to have made the payments. They're certainly not going to have taken care of the house. And I would be shocked if they paid any of the taxes. I just closed the transaction a few weeks ago for someone that may actually be on this Zoom, and he bought a property out of a foreclosure of a condominium association's non-payment of the monthly assessments. So for like, I don't know, $6,000 or $8,000, he got himself a $120,000 property. Now it's subject to the first mortgage. We went and checked, and we figured, if you're not making your commons charge payments, you're probably not paying your taxes either. Every single tax bill was paid. Perfect. At some point, we've given the people notice to get out. We can't get them out, obviously, until August. But hopefully there's enough money built into the fact that he bought the property for so little that it's going to be worth it in the long term. But we don't know how much the first mortgage is, and the first mortgage holders, I think it's Mr. Cooper, which is a major bank, and they're not even responding to my letters because they don't have to. And I'm sure up until the day that before they found out the house was lost to them, that they probably were making all of the mortgage payments. If the bank starts a foreclosure, my client we will finally get some information as to who I can talk to about paying off that mortgage. The problem being that by the time we get to that point, if they don't just voluntarily contact me, you've got thousands of dollars worth of attorney's fees and assorted other stuff. So, you try to avoid that. It's the attorney's fees and disbursements on these things that can kill you. I had a real estate closing where the seller's attorney guaranteed payment of about 7 years worth of taxes. That weren't, some of them were in foreclosure, some of them weren't, and she did in fact pay 6 years worth of the taxes, and then she moved to Georgia, and the taxes were $1,500. And by the time we found out that she had not paid the taxes, the ATF or one of those companies had purchased it, and the legal fees for the $1,500 were $3,500. I wrote her a letter asking her to take care of her guarantee, and she told me to stick it. So I actually had to pay $5,000 for my buyer's taxes, where there was no liability at all on my part, but I certainly couldn't allow the property to be foreclosed. It's just one of the risks you take in this business. Is Michelle Wheeler on this call? I know Michelle is trying to fix a situation which is very similar to this one, where some taxes were paid. We also have a situation now where I represented the seller and guaranteed the taxes, and we had a letter from one of these tax services saying that the amount owed was $0. And 2 months after the closing, they said, "Whoops, we made a mistake. You owe us $2,000." So my partner is now suing them, and we'll see what happens. In the meantime, every single day I get an email from the buyer's attorney saying, "When are you going to pay these taxes?"
Steve, have you seen it all lately, like ATFS is negotiating like they say they're owed $5,000 and now they're negotiating, or are they still sticking with what the full amount they're owed is?
Between the two law firms, we begged them to reduce their $3,500 in legal fees, and they did me a favor and they reduced it by $250. So that's what you're seeing.
Hey,
Thanks.
Steve, we have a couple questions in the chat box from some people who are being shy. Zach Darrow, who is the least shy guy I know, has a question about capital gains tax, but I don't know exactly what it's in reference to. So if Zach is still on, if he can speak up and clarify what it is he would like to know.
Yeah,
about
I'm here.
All right. Use your words.
I was when he was talking about the double close, I was curious if someone has to sell a property, is there short-term capital gains tax for the person who just sold the property?
I'd say sure.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
probably, it kind of sucks at that point to be a wholesaler because now you got to
Yeah,
pay capital
it's
gains
just
on it, right?
normal everyday income. I agree. Absolutely.
Okay.
There just has to be enough in the assignment to justify it.
That makes sense. All right. Next question is from Drew Kingsley. Any thoughts on rooming houses, boarding houses, shared accommodation properties rented by the room or by the week? Would courts expect 14 days notice of petition for non-payment or holdover when the agreement is week to week?
I have not done an eviction from those, but I'm absolutely positive that they would require the 14 days. If the property is zoned properly and you can do a boarding house, I don't know anyone that's ever done it that has not made money with a boarding house. But you have to be incredibly hands-on.
Let's see. Would housing as a service agreement on a weekly basis be treated as a lease subject to landlord-tenant law?
I think absolutely.
Yes.
And how might rent control be imposed on such a property?
No idea.
Okay.
God forbid we have to ever answer that question here. I don't know.
And
I don't know how rent control is going to kick in general if it ever floats down here.
And then any other considerations with boarding houses that you might have?
The biggest problem that I've seen, and that's why it's just important to be very hands-on, is the tenants' relationships to each other, and the bad things that can happen when two tenants don't like each other. They can destroy literally the rapport of the entire building, and it's very difficult to get it's a difficult thing to evict a person for being a bad tenant.
Okay. Awesome. And we have one other question from Joshua Lev regarding LLCs for protecting assets. Is there an advantage to having an LLC versus an umbrella policy for $1 million?
I think you should have. I personally think you should have both. I just think that for what you spend for an LLC, it's really a one-time only expense. You're paying up front for the lawyer and for the filing fees and the publication. You're putting it on your regular schedules for your tax returns. You're not, excuse me, you're not paying anything more to your accountant. That it's just a good idea. I have a swimming pool in my backyard. I have a $1 million umbrella because of that. So I think that's a great idea, but I still would do both.
I agree.
I always use the example years and years ago. Mortgages were freely assumable. You could get an FHA mortgage, and the day after, someone could assume it without making application or doing it anything of any kind. And a number of people had assumed this mortgage all through the years. So maybe over 15 years, there were 5 closings, 5 people had assumed it. Then the property goes into foreclosure, and the bank attorney looks at excuse me. The bank attorney looks at who the prior owners were, and discovers that a friend of mine who owned First National Bank at the time he was an attorney, he owned First National Bank, that he had been one of the people that guaranteed the loan. So instead of foreclosing on the property, they just said to him, we're going to sue you personally on the debt. You need to just send us a check for X dollars. And he did that. Well, the $1 million insurance policy, if you're an individual, is kind of similar to that. If you've got an LLC, it is almost impossible for them to chase you personally. If you have $1 million policy and you've got a multi-million-dollar house on Lake Avenue or on East Avenue, it gives the attorney representing that little kid that may have eaten lead paint or whatever other lawsuit there is, an incentive to go for more than $1 million. So from my perspective, that's why I really do think you should do both.
I agree. I agree. I agree.
All right.
What'd you see?
So do we have any other questions from folks?
No. No.
That's all that was in the chat.
I had a question too about like the whole cancel rent movement, and do you think that that will affect the courts when it comes time to collecting, when it comes time to finally getting judgments on non-paying tenants?
I don't know how it is going to affect the courts, but I think it will definitely affect the courts. I think they're going to give people time to pay. I think everything is going to get extended. I just don't see city court judges who, before the pandemic, I thought bent over backwards for tenants, not doing the same thing in August, September, October, assuming that we can even start doing this in August.
Right. I agree.
Anybody disagree?
No. No, you're right.
I wish I was
What
right.
about, just a quick follow-up, what about using the holdover instead? So if you have someone who's non-paying, but they're also doing something minor that you can technically cancel the lease, for example, 2 missed payments, 2 late payments in 4 months, or not taking out the trash, or something where you can terminate their lease and then do a holdover rather than a non-payment eviction, will the judges see through that and cancel you because of that, because they think that you're just trying to?
I would say there's 1,000% chance of that. I have never, all the times that I've sat in city court, I have never seen a court do an eviction over violating terms of a lease that did not have anything to do with an actual holdover or actual non-payment. What I've gone to the town of Greece and I've evicted people for having dogs when the lease says no dogs, and I've won. I've gone to the city of Rochester trying to do the same thing, and the judge just laughs at you. I had an eviction that we lost in the city of Rochester. My client had tried to evict this person half a dozen times before he met me, and we went to the city of Rochester. The city wouldn't evict him, and excuse me. And my client said to me, 7 years ago when I tried to evict this person in the town of Arundecoit, it just seemed a lot easier. I said, well, what do you mean in the town of Arundecoit? Nobody realized that the property was in Arundecoit. So we actually withdrew the case in the city, which we never would have won because the judge was just 1,000% in the tenant's corner. And 2 weeks later, I had a warrant out of Arundecoit. So it just depends on where you are.
True. True. Yeah, very true.
I have a tenant that I did an eviction on, and we had gone to court, and they weren't moving out. And so the marshals serve, you have 14 days to move out or get locked out, and then the court's closed. Do we know when, with the courts opening back up, when am I going to be able to finish that process?
I think it's going to depend on when the marshals come back to work, and I have no idea when that's going to be. I would, starting next Monday, I think if every couple of days I would call city court and see if the marshals are back to work.
Okay.
Because the marshal's going to probably have to go out and do the whole 14 days over again.
Right. Probably have to serve that 14-day letter again, right?
I would think.
Lock
Yeah.
them up.
And I know I don't think there's any possibility that marshals are working right now. And I don't think they'll be back next week, but hopefully 2 or 3 weeks from now, you'll be able to get a better answer to that.
Do we know legally when the marshals can start working
No.
again?
Nope. Nope, not until I think we move into phase 2 or phase 3, and we're still in phase 1.
It's true. That's true.
Hopefully within the next 2 weeks, things are going to open up more. The fact that the court is opening is a good start.
Right.
Now, I don't think there's any good answer at this point.
Steve, I called the bank about one of our rentals, and as far as extending the mortgage payments, and all they offered was forbearance, which means at the end of 3 months, I'd have to pay 4 months. I talked to my son in Florida. He's with Wells Fargo. Of course, this is his own house, and they extended his payments 3 or 4 months.
I've heard of a number of banks have actually done that. That's not unusual.
There's an article that came out either yesterday or today. Not to cut Steve off, but
No, feel free.
banks are actually being forced now. If they are a Fannie or Freddie lender, they are no longer allowed to give you the balloon payment. They have to add it on to the end of your mortgage, even if you do the 180 days twice.
Where'd you see that?
That was in a multi-housing news brief release today, and I sent it to actually to Jamie Kane, and they're putting it up on their resources page. So it'll be on Boiling Code's page probably.
Outstanding. Boiling Code has done everybody a service for letting her actually work on this every day. Because I assume that she hasn't left Buffalo since March. She's doing it all from home.
So it doesn't matter if it's a mortgage for a rental or your own personal mortgage?
Does not. Should be able to do it either way. I have a lease with a company, and in the 1990s when they signed the Second Amendment. I mean, there've probably been a dozen amendments on this commercial deal. It had, I don't know if you've heard the terms force majeure, but if there's an act of God or the government, you don't have to pay rent. And I represent the landlord, and the lease has wonderful language that allows the tenant not to pay rent during this pandemic. The question is, which you're going to, at some point, if there's going to be a mediator, a judge deciding, is whether the tenant thinks that if he doesn't pay rent for 3 months, forget about those 3 months. You add 3 months to the end of the lease, and he pays for 3 more months. Now, that's a net loss of 3 months. I think in the 4th month, he owes 4 months. So the court's going to have to decide which one of us is right. Anybody?
He's to support what you're saying, he's got to pay the 3 months that he didn't pay.
I would think that he would have to pay the 3 months that he didn't pay, but it's not the most articulate language in the world. And his position is that he can just extend the lease for an extra 3 months, and that's how my client's going to get the money, which to me is just crazy.
The tenant wins twice. He gets to stay 3
Wins
months,
twice, correct?
and he doesn't have to pay 3 months of when he was
more
in.
time at a lower amount, and he gets to steal the three months when he clearly got PPP money, which he should have used to pay the rent.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, thanks.
Steve, have you seen any changes in how long it typically takes for banks to process mortgage applications for owner-occupied mortgages?
It does not seem to be taking any longer, which I just think the reason is that because everybody's just sitting at their house with nothing else to do except write the application and underwrite it. I'm not seeing it take significantly longer on most transactions. Obviously, the whole income thing. If your entire company is shut down, how do you get somebody to verify employment? I mean, I've had clients that actually called the president of the company, and the president of the company called the bank to say that she was still employed.
Can I chime in there for a minute too and say that in terms of appraisals on owner-occupied properties, because of COVID, FHA, which I was very surprised, is allowing drive-by appraisals. They do not have to go into the house for an appraisal. And in one situation, I sold a house where pretty sure if the appraiser went in, they would have probably nailed the electrical system at least. And because they didn't, it went through. So that I was very surprised that FHA would allow that.
It's fear. Nobody wants to send the appraiser in and have the appraiser get the virus. That's, I think, really the bottom line. Are you finding that any of your people are having longer to get a mortgage?
No.
I don't think so.
No, actually, it might even be quicker in most of the cases. And probably because the loan officers and the underwriters are working out of their house and trying to diligently show.
Yeah, I mean, we just hired a new person to just do refinances. We think the refinance market is going to pop, and it's going to justify him working full time for us now.
Yep.
Steve, I actually just found that article. It was not Multi-Housing News. It was Housing Wire. So Housing Wire has it. If you Google Fannie Freddie forbearance, it was from last night.
Thank you. Great.
And the only red tape is if it ever goes to be refinanced, they have to pay the balloon in that case, which when you refinance,
it would make
anyway.
sense. In the scheme of things, it would make sense. Sure. That's great. Thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. So basically right on time and our normal meeting time for our discussion. Really, just wanted to make sure people are aware all of our meetings are online now, and you may want to make sure that folks that are aware of Freedom First are aware of the fact that we basically are we're putting everything online, and we'll see how long we continue to be online, but I think it's going to be a little bit longer than anybody wants it to be.
Yes, so do I.
Yeah, so you can go to the website and you can sign right up just like you did for this one, and we'll see you then.
Are you going to be sending your your ribs around to people so we can have a virtual picnic?
Well,
All right.
just put it this way, we're praying, although I don't think it's gonna happen, that we'll be able to do a picnic or a holiday party, but, you know, we'll see. I don't think that the ribs are gonna, unless somebody gonna drive past my door and pick some up or something. I don't think they work that well in the mail going out to folks.
That's right.
Delivery?
Eve, before we go,
Don't ask us if we want to do a drive-by because we probably will.
And I think that's true.
For sure.
Yeah. We'll keep it in mind.
Great, sir.
Yep. So I'm going to unless someone else had something else. So,
Yes.
Joe.
As Joe's got something.
yes, I do, and I can't find it. Do you know where it is, Susan?
You don't.
Hang
That's the
on.
raffle thing you're talking about?
All right, I will fill in the awkward silence. Just as a side note, if you are not a member, join. Your money is going to a lot of good causes. I believe the board announced a $3,000 second donation to Under One Roof, which is huge. So that puts us at about $8,000 for this year so far. That's going to Fight the Fight. The second thing is everybody should have gotten a survey last week. If you have not done it, please do it. It went right to my spam box. I use Outlook 365. It got filtered. Go look for it. It is there. It's from SurveyMonkey.
There we go.
I filled in the time.
Yeah, I mean, let me just add a little bit to what you were saying there. You know, basically, we've given the dollars to Under One Roof, and clearly, if you look at the total folks that make up this organization, they're certainly not all landlords. A couple of key things. One, the fight that the landlords are fighting now associated with rent control and all those sorts of things. I don't care if you're just a wholesaler, it's still going to impact you. So, but the key thing is we look at it from the perspective that the monies that we have over time, we've built up a few dollars, and we think that on behalf of our members, it only makes sense that we would provide the funds to help fight this challenge we have. So I mean, it really is just that simple. I mean, clearly, someone could argue, well, maybe they should be holding on to the money and not spending it, but at some point in time, you know, you have to decide either you're going to fight or you're not. And this is one of those things that it makes a lot more sense to fight than try to see what the answer is going to be, because if things get put in place, it's going to be pretty hard to get it undone. So just want to add those few words in case people had some questions as to what we're doing and why. Joe, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Yes, we'd said we would have a drawing this evening, actually 2 drawings for dinner from, takeout dinner from Da Vinci's. And I spoke to Da Vinci's today, talked to Marjorie. And, you know, they're there, they're doing takeout, and they're doing some specials. But they are open for takeout and some delivery. But we said we would have 2 drawings. So what we'll do is and these are random drawings from our website for people that had registered. So the first one, let's see how it works. Oh, goodness. All right. Okay. Mr. Joe LaBarbera.
I would have put money on that.
Of course. Mr. Moneybags.
Bringing us all to dinner.
That's right, Joe.
Oh my God, are you serious?
You can't make this stuff up.
I don't control it. It's random.
I've never
You
been
could use the heat a little bit.
realize this, right?
And the second one is Dale Byrne.
Wow.
So if you guys want to get with me tomorrow or give me a call tomorrow or email me, I told Marjorie I would give her a call tomorrow and tell her who the winners were. And then their cards, and you can call, order your dinner, and they'll use the card and just go pick it up. So.
Very nice.
Well, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks
Thank
everyone
you.
for being here.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks,
for
Steve.
your time.
Look forward to
You're
seeing
welcome.
at the next meeting. And it's not the next general meeting. We still have, 5 meetings a month. So now it's very easy for you to hop on Zoom and be a part of them.
Thank you.
Hey,
Thanks,
Leon, real
everyone.
quick.
Steve, tell
Good night,
me hello.
everyone.
Dan Graff.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Nice seeing you.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah,
Hey,
thank
you're
you,
welcome.
Steve.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Steve.
Steve. Good night, all. Good night.
Good night.
Leon,
Yes.
hey, real quick. I could not write fast enough when Steve was talking. Will we be able to replay this video at some point in the future?
I have it recorded, so the answer is yes. We will edit some awkward silence moments and some other stuff out of it before we publish it.
You can also send me an email asking any specific questions. No problem.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
I appreciate
No problem
that.
at all.
All
Steve,
right.
when's a good time to catch up with you? I have a couple of questions for you.
I'm in the office every day. Email me. We'll set something up. We can do it on the phone or we can do it like this.
Okay, great. That'd be good.
All right.
All right, thanks a lot, Steve.
Perfect.
Nice talking
Sure.
to you.
Talk to you later.
Maybe
Bye-bye.
the best thing to do would be to interact with Steve directly.
Yes, I will.
No, I was saying to Earl.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I sure will.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Thank you,
All right.
everyone. Bye-bye.
You're gonna send me an email. I'm gonna send you the the financing language too.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
All
Talk to you
bye.
tomorrow.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.